The cry that shattered silence, the first scream, cut through the polished air of the mansion like a knife. Crystal chandeliers trembled ever so slightly above the marble floors, catching the light in frozen prisms, as if even the architecture itself held its breath. The baby's wails echoed from the nursery, high-pitched and urgent, bouncing off the walls and silencing every conversation mid-laughter. Guests paused mid-toast, glasses hovering in the air, unsure if they had witnessed a trick of acoustics or the sudden unraveling of something far more profound. No one had expected this. In a house built to impress, where every detail screamed power and perfection, a small human voice, pure, raw, and unfiltered, shattered the veneer. Servants froze. The maître d'hôtel's hand hesitated mid-step. Even the chef, who prided himself on precision and control, stopped in the middle of arranging a, and in the midst of this frozen tableau, the baby's gaze fixed on a single figure, the new maid. She stood there, shoulders straight, hands clasped loosely, eyes lowered not out of shame, but careful observation. She was nothing like the glamorous women gliding through the hall, nothing like the polished staff who moved without causing a ripple. Her uniform was simple, her shoes worn, yet she carried an air of quiet dignity that seemed to defy the hierarchy surrounding her. And still, the baby's cries only grew louder. The millionaire appeared then, stepping into the nursery doorway with a calmness that seemed almost unnatural. He was a man accustomed to attention, accustomed to controlling every room he entered. Yet, as he looked at the scene before him, his child screaming at the presence of this maid, the guests frozen in uneasy silence, something shifted in his eyes. Not anger, not impatience, but a subtle recognition, a flicker of curiosity and unease. "What is it?" he asked softly, his voice almost lost in the echo of the baby's sobs. The staff exchanged nervous glances, careful not to meet his gaze. Some tried to soothe the baby with toys and coos, but nothing worked. The sound persisted, tearing through the composure of the mansion, exposing the cracks in a world that prided itself on control. Guests began whispering, the hush transforming into a tense murmur. "Why is he crying?" one asked, a hint of fear in their tone. "At her," another whispered, their voice barely audible. Social norms, etiquette, and the carefully maintained image of wealth seemed to bend and fracture under the raw honesty of a child's instinct. And then, the millionaire spoke, just a few words, delivered in that measured, almost detached tone that somehow carried both authority and vulnerability. "Let him be." Silence fell immediately after. Not the heavy silence of obedience, but the unsettled, electric silence of curiosity and disbelief. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the chandeliers seemed to pause mid-swing, holding the moment suspended in a strange, cinematic stillness. His words were simple, but they contained a weight that rippled through the room, a quiet acknowledgement that sometimes the smallest voices reveal truths the largest egos could not. It was a statement that set the tone for everything that would follow. In that moment, the veneer of perfection cracked. The hierarchy, the wealth, the glimmering facadas, they all became secondary to something profoundly human. Eyes, once polite and indifferent, now traced the maid's every movement. Hands that had held champagne flutes lightly now clutched them tightly. Heart, previously guarded and assured by privilege, beat a little faster. The baby continued to cry, but it was no longer merely noise. It was a signal, a call to notice, to reckon, to confront the unseen truths lurking in the polished corridors of wealth. And as whispers began to spread across the mansion, the attention that had never before touched the maid fell squarely upon her. Ordinary, unnoticed, yet suddenly carrying the weight of extraordinary judgment. No one knew what would happen next. The room held its collective breath, aware that this was the first domino to fall in a series of events that would challenge every assumption about power, privilege, and human dignity. And the millionaires standing quietly at the threshold seemed to understand that the moment was larger than himself, larger than any carefully constructed image, larger even than the mansion that had always felt invincible. As the baby's cries echoed one last time before fading into uncertain whimpers, the tension remained. Every eye followed the maid, every mind wondered what would come next. And in that charged, suspended silence, it was already clear. Nothing in this house or the world outside would ever be quite the same again. As whispers spread through the mansion, eyes turned to the maid, an ordinary woman who suddenly carried the weight of extraordinary judgment. Dignity meets arrogance. Darun had barely recovered from the baby's wail when whispers began to snake through the grand hall like smoke. Conversations that had once centered on art collections, charity donations, and the latest European vacations now pivoted to one impossible question. Who was this maid? The staff murmured among themselves, uneasy with the sudden attention, while the guests' polite curiosity carried an undercurrent of judgment. The maid stood with a quiet poise that seemed almost deliberate. Her hands remained folded in front of her, her gaze steady but not confrontational. She did not flinch when the infant's cries pierced the air, and she did not shrink under the weight of every eye in the room. In that stillness, there was a dignity that seemed to bend time, forcing even the most entitled to pause and reckon with something they rarely encountered. Authenticity untouched by wealth, status, or pretense. By contrast, the millionaire's social circle fidgeted and shifted, a living reflection of privilege meeting resistance. High-heeled shoes tapped impatiently against the marble. Gloves were adjusted nervously. Men in tailored suits whispered into crystal glasses, eyes darting toward. The maid was something between suspicion and incredulity. Their carefully curated airs of superiority trembled ever so slightly, destabilized by a presence that refused to acknowledge their constructed hierarchies. A woman in a diamond necklace leaned toward her companion, voice low but sharp enough to carry. Why is he reacting like this? The baby's never done this before. And look at her, how does she even stand there? Her words dripped with subtle disdain, the kind that masquerades as concern but is rooted in entitlement. Across the room, a man laughed nervously, attempting to diffuse the tension, but even his bravado faltered under the gravity of the maid's quiet gaze. Meanwhile, the millionaire lingered near the nursery doorway, observing without interference. He had always commanded rooms with gestures and words, yet now he felt a disorienting unfamiliarity. He watched the maid and the baby, noting the instinctive connection, or rather, the instinctive alarm that had thrown the household into chaos. There was no formula to control it, no protocol to quiet the dissonance. His wealth, his power, his social dominance all seemed powerless against the unspoken truths that now occupied the space between them. The staff, sensing the fragility of their employer's curated image, began to murmur. One whispered that perhaps she wasn't qualified. Another hinted at impropriety, raising questions that had no evidence but plenty of insinuation. Gossip spread like wildfire, feeding the anxiety of the social elite while testing the maid's composure. Yet she neither spoke in defense nor faltered under scrutiny. Her silence became a shield, her dignity an unspoken challenge to every whispered insult. The baby, unaware of the complexities swirling around him, continued to cry not out of fear, but as if voicing a truth everyone else was too polite or too blind to see. In that sound, the hierarchy of the mansion cracked. The invisible rules of wealth and status became transparent under the innocent insistence of a child, exposing prejudices and anxieties that had never dared surface. Each sob became a mirror, reflecting the subtle cruelties and latent fears of those who relied on privilege for validation. Guests exchanged glances, some intrigued, some scandalized, and some quietly unsettled in ways they could not name. The maid's calm presence amplified the tension. Every gaze that landed on her seemed to highlight the contrast between integrity and arrogance, humility and entitlement. The more the socialites tried to assert dominance with smiles, jokes, or well-timed laughter, the more hollow it felt. Their facades began to wobble under the weight of a simple, human truth. Dignity cannot be faked. Even a millionaire, normally impervious to judgment, felt the subtle sting of self-awareness. For a moment, he questioned his own complicity in a system that judged people for reasons as trivial as clothing, accent, or station in life. Yet his attention remained anchored on the baby and the maid, two figures whose interaction had unintentionally revealed the moral fault lines of an entire household. Tension thickened as the hour stretched. Every footstep, every cough, every hesitant glance became amplified in the charged silence. The contrast between hero and villain, between human dignity and societal arrogance, could not have been clearer. And yet, for all the scrutiny and judgment, the maid did not flinch. She did not plead. She did not even look away. Her presence alone seemed to challenge an unspoken hierarchy, forcing everyone in the room to reconsider what power truly meant. Then, as if sensing the rising stakes and the fragile equilibrium in the room, the baby did something unexpected. A tiny movement, a sudden gesture, or a gaze that carried clarity far beyond his years, something that silenced the murmurs, froze their hands mid-gesture, and made even the millionaire pause in stunned recognition. It was a moment that none of them could explain, yet everyone felt its weight. The room held its breath, all eyes turned, hearts pounded, and, in that charged instant, it became painfully clear that this was no ordinary day in the mansion. Something profound had been set in motion, and for the first time, the billionaire realized that wealth could not control innocence, that privilege could not dictate instinct, and that the smallest among them might just reveal the truths they had been too comfortable to face. But just when everyone thought they understood the story, the baby did something no one could explain, forcing even the millionaire to confront a truth he had ignored. The baby's unseen wisdom, the crying did not stop. Hours passed, and the baby's wails became a rhythm against the polished walls of the mansion, a stubborn pulse that refused to be ignored. The guests, once curious, now whispered with growing unease. Each glance toward the maid carried suspicion, each murmur a question the heir dared not voice. Why does he cry for her? Why not us? Cameras discreetly clicked, phones trembled and hidden pockets, and the rumor of the moment began to spread beyond gilded doors, an incident destined to become a viral spectacle in a world hungry for scandal and spectacle. The staff, already anxious, exchanged uneasy glances. One housekeeper muttered under her breath about favoritism, another hinted at incompetence masked by humility. Hidden grievances rose to the surface, broken promises, unfair schedules, tiny injustices that had long been swept under the rug of etiquette and etiquette alone. The baby's insistence became a mirror, reflecting not just immediate discomfort but years of quiet oppression, subtle corruption, and the hierarchy that had allowed small cruelties to fester unchecked. Meanwhile, the millionaire wandered from room to room, observing these ripples of tension as though he were seeing the mansion for the first time. The walls, once comforting in their grandeur, now felt like a stage for truth too long ignored. Conversations he had overheard earlier, carefully framed jokes, polite critiques of staff, strategic nods to reinforce loyalty took on new meaning. Under the weight of innocence, privilege, it seemed, had dulled his perception of simple honesty, and now it was impossible to ignore. The baby, unaware of social implications, refused every attempt at comfort. Toys, lullabies, even the softest tones of a caregiver's voice failed to sway him. It was as if the child saw past the layers of wealth and presentation, past the careful facades of high society, and responded only to the integrity or lack thereof he sensed around him. In the tension of each cry, there was a hidden logic, a kind of unspoken accusation aimed at a house that had long valued appearances over humanity. Guests, growing restless, began to shift uncomfortably. Some laughed nervously, masking judgment as amusement. Others frowned, their social training battling instinct. Every word spoken seemed inadequate, every gesture exaggerated in the effort to maintain control. Social media notifications buzzed quietly in hidden devices, snippets of the unfolding drama already beginning to circulate online. What had started as a private moment was fast becoming a public spectacle, a morality play with a child at its center. Inside the mansion, subtle fractures widened. The maid remained calm, her composure a stark counterpoint to the disarray surrounding her. Every whispered insult, every sideways glance, seemed only to reinforce her quiet authority. Integrity, it appeared, did not require applause. It existed in the space between what was expected and what was real. For the first time, the millionaire truly saw this contrast. Humility versus entitlement, truth versus performance, innocence versus calculated cruelty. Conversations between staff became more candid. A valet muttered about how certain members of the household leveraged their power for personal gain, small betrayals previously dismissed as trivial. A cook revealed that requests had been ignored, favoritism shown, small acts of neglect justified under the guise of efficiency. These stories, previously confined to hushed corners, now seemed illuminated by the baby's unfiltered judgment. In the cries and refusals, the child had become a silent arbiter, exposing hypocrisies the adults had long ignored. The millionaire, observing from the doorway, felt an unfamiliar weight press against him. He had always measured success by acquisition, by the precision of control, by the ability to command respect without question. Now, in the face of a baby's simple, unwavering honesty, He questioned not just the rules of the house, but the rules of life he had taken for granted. Wealth could shield him from consequence, but it could not shield him from conscience. He felt a subtle moral friction, a tension between comfort and accountability that refused to be soothed. The tension, built in slow motion, every glance, every whisper, every hesitant gesture became charged with meaning. The mansion, once a monument to status, now felt like a crucible. The guests' sophistication could not temper the raw moral clarity being forced upon them. The staff's anxieties could not conceal the truth in the child's perception, and the millionaire, despite decades of control, felt the unrelenting pressure of revelation pressing against his carefully maintained world. Then, in the midst of mounting tension, the baby acted in a way no one could have predicted. A gesture, subtle but intentional, a look, a motion so small yet so precise it forced every eye to acknowledge the reality that had been simmering beneath the surface. In that instant, the unspoken hierarchies, the prejudices, the assumptions of power were called into question. The moment held the weight of inevitability. Innocence had revealed truths that privilege had long ignored, and nothing in the mansion or beyond would ever be the same. Then, in a moment no one could have predicted, the baby's action forced a revelation that changed everything in the mansion and left the world watching. The words that stopped the room fell into a sudden, suffocating silence. The baby's tiny hand pointed, then pressed against the marble floor as if marking a boundary invisible to everyone else. Eyes widened, breaths caught, and for the first time, the guests felt the weight of their own arrogance pressing down upon them. No one dared move. Even the chandeliers seemed to hold still, suspended in the gravity of the moment. The child, in an innocent but piercing gesture, had revealed what no one in the mansion had dared acknowledge: the quiet cruelty behind their politeness, the emptiness behind their titles, the fragility behind their wealth. The millionaire stepped forward, his voice steady but layered with an unfamiliar vulnerability. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "we've spent too long measuring people by what they own, by the faces they wear, by the applause they can command. And in the process, we've forgotten the simplest truth. Humanity doesn't ask for permission. And dignity isn't a privilege, it's a right." Gasps rippled across the room. The guests, who had spent decades perfecting the art of influence and indifference, could not ignore the bluntness of his words. A man adjusted his cufflinks, then realized the gesture was meaningless here. A woman's smile faltered, her pearls suddenly heavy around her neck. The socialites had been trained to respond with decorum, but decorum had no answer for the quiet, unwavering judgment of a child. Even staff who had once doubted the maid's presence now looked at her differently. Every step she took, every subtle tilt of her head, spoke louder than the loudest declarations of wealth. Her dignity was unshakable, a counterpoint to the crumbling facades around her. Whispers of admiration and disbelief mingled with the hum of suppressed shame, and for the first time, the mansion was measured not in assets, but in integrity. The baby, oblivious to the chaos he had orchestrated, clapped once, then pressed his tiny fingers together in a gesture of clarity, as if signaling that the truth had been spoken. Social media feeds, already buzzing with snippets of the morning's drama, erupted. Hashtags spread like wildfire. Hashtag truth in innocence. Hashtag dignity over wealth. Hashtag mansion moment. Overnight, millions debated the scene, dissecting every look, every gesture, every unspoken word. What had seemed private had become universal, a reflection of society itself, and the cracks in its carefully constructed hierarchies. The millionaire's reflection deepened. He glanced around the room, noting the fissures in every practiced smile and in every uneasy posture. "We are measured," he continued, "not by our bank accounts, our influence, or our networks, but by the courage we show when confronted with the unseen, the overlooked, the disregarded. Today, I am reminded that power without empathy is hollow, and wealth without conscience is empty." The villains of the story, those who had relied on privilege, judgment, and social theater, could no longer hide behind whispers or carefully timed gestures. Their cracks were exposed. Nervous glances, half-smiles failing to mask discomfort, rigid postures betraying panic. Every attempt to reclaim authority only underscored the truth the baby had illuminated. Meanwhile, the hero remained serene, every inch of her composure a testament to the enduring strength of character over circumstance. Guests and staff alike began to recognize something they had long ignored. The measure of a person was not in the grandeur of their environment, but in the integrity of their presence. The mansion, once a monument to status and appearances, had become a stage for moral reckoning, and in that still, charged space, the collective awareness was undeniable. The child's simplicity had shattered the complex illusions of entitlement. Voices rose, softly at first, then more confidently. Discussions that had been muted by fear or etiquette now surfaced openly. Admissions of mistakes, acknowledgments of oversight, and subtle apologies formed a chorus beneath the echoes of the baby's insistence. The millionaire's words acted as a catalyst, but it was the child's perception that had initiated the revolution. Social media buzzed louder, the incident discussed on international feeds, forums, and live streams. Millions watched, debated, and reflected on the stark contrast between humility and arrogance, dignity and entitlement. For a moment, time itself seemed to pause. The baby, innocent and unassuming, had become the arbiter of truth. The millionaire, moved in ways he had not anticipated, had spoken with an honesty that left no room for denial. The villains could no longer maintain their masks, and the hero's quiet courage illuminated every corner of the room. It was a revelation that resonated far beyond the walls of the mansion, a lesson in humility, integrity, and the unseen power of innocence. What happened next sparked a debate that divided social media overnight. The world watched, mesmerized by the raw collision of wealth, privilege, and human truth, and in that charged silence, one thing was undeniable. Nothing in that house or the conversations it inspired would ever be the same again. But the story didn't end there. The consequences of that one moment rippled far beyond the mansion. Walls, reaching places. Dignity over power. The mansion had changed. What once was a stage for appearances and whispered judgments had become a reflection of conscience, humility, and accountability. The millionaire, once defined by wealth and influence alone, began to make choices that startled even those closest to him. Publicly, he spoke about fairness, about the responsibility that came with privilege, and about the need to measure life not in possessions but in human decency. Privately, he took steps to correct past oversights, offering support to staff who had long labored in silence and acknowledging injustices he had once ignored. The maid, whose quiet courage had shifted the tone of the entire household, gained a recognition that required no applause. Guests, staff, and strangers alike began to see her not as someone of lowly station, but as a symbol of integrity and dignity. Her calm composure had exposed arrogance, softened hardened hearts, and reminded everyone that character cannot be purchased. Social media buzzed with admiration, people sharing the story across borders, dissecting the lesson embedded in the baby's unfiltered truth, and reflecting on the simplicity of courage. The baby, oblivious to the chaos he had sparked, became an unlikely icon. Videos, images, and anecdotes of his reaction circulated worldwide, inspiring discussions about empathy, innocence, and the power of noticing what others overlook. Millions debated, shared, and reflected, and in living rooms and offices, conversations about privilege, morality, and responsibility were sparked not by force, but by the honesty of a child and the dignity of a maid. The lessons settled slowly, like sunlight spilling into corners long ignored. Wealth could no longer shield one from scrutiny, and power could no longer disguise neglect. The true measure of influence had become clear, lay in compassion, integrity, and the courage to confront uncomfortable truths. Even the millionaire, once so certain of his control, understood that real leadership came not from commanding others but from honoring the humanity in every person. And as the mansion returned to its quiet rhythm, the echo of that one extraordinary day lingered. It was not the chandelier's sparkle or the marble's polish that mattered, but the enduring clarity of dignity standing unshaken amidst arrogance. In the end, the story of a baby's innocent insistence and a maid's unwavering grace reminded everyone power without conscience is hollow, privilege without empathy is empty, and true wealth is measured by courage, humanity, and moral clarity. Sometimes, the richest things in life aren't money, power, or status, they're the truths we refuse to ignore. No one expected